Mike Green, I'm here in Sacramento, California for Real Vision. I'm really excited to sit down with Stephen Greenhut. Steve, you and I met for the first time about 10 years ago in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in New York City. You came to the Manhattan Institute to speak about a book that you had written called Plunder. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Plunder, what it was about.
Sure, I call it the subtly titled book Plunder. It's about public employee unions, and it's based on my reporting when I was at the Orange County Register and covering the 34 cities that are in the county. And I was looking at their finances, looking at local politics, looking at the pension crisis that was starting to evolve. And the main takeaway that I had through my reporting was the outsized power of public employee unions, especially police and fire unions, who seem to run amok in local city councils. They run amok a few blocks away here in the state capitol, but there aren't many countervailing forces at the local level that come anywhere close to the power they have. And as a result, they've gotten a level of pay and pensions and medical benefits that dwarf other public employees and certainly are way beyond what the average person receives.
Well, and this was definitely true in 2009, right? Because we'd had the global financial crisis, we'd experienced severe financial distress in the US equity markets, the pensions had underperformed, particularly over the prior decade relative to expectations. We've had a number of guests here in Sacramento talk about SB 400 and the expansion of the pension benefits that occurred during the dot-com cycle. But that's all been fixed now, right?
No, it hasn't been fixed. We haven't done anything about it. And I shouldn't say we, the state government and the localities, and now the localities are suffering. Now, you mentioned SB 400, which really started the huge problems we have in California. That was passed in 1999. Overwhelmingly, the CalPERS, the California Public Employee Retirement System proposal, they said it wouldn't cost taxpayers a dime. They assumed by 2009 that the return on investments, the stock market, the Dow Jones would be hitting 25,000 for it to not cost taxpayers a dime. I think it was under 9,000 in 2009. They were right. It didn't cost taxpayers a dime. It cost taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. And that was the start of it. And it was retroactive. So the SB 400 gave retroactive benefit increases, 50% increases to California Highway Patrol, something called 3% at 50. You receive 3% of your final year's pay times the number of years worked. So if you work 30 years, you get 90% of your final pay plus the various pension spiking gimmicks that can push it even higher than that. And it's a guaranteed pension. So they passed that and they did it retroactively. So if I'm about to retire tomorrow, I get the 50% hike going all the way back to when I started 30 years ago. And then the goal was to have that copied throughout the state. And most police and fire departments, not all, but most of them across the state did the same thing. So it just spread like wildfire. And what we got was a massive increase in the cost of pensions, and it was supposed to be paid for by stock market returns. But what goes up must come down, and then we had the financial crash, and all of a sudden we got into these levels of unfunded pension liabilities, which is just a fancy word for debt. And the localities, many of which supported this and kind of lobbied for these benefits. And of course, a lot of the people working for the city got a lot of the benefits too. They just never, they acted like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how this happened. Well, it happened because you gave away the store and then the stock market went down, as it ultimately does every once in a while.
So it feels inevitable that the stock market could go down and you're exposed to that type of risk. But we forget to a certain extent the dynamics that existed at that time period, right? Because the dot-com cycle had led to such an extraordinary windfall for California across geographies, right? So Southern California had the Qualcomms, et cetera, of the world. Northern California, in terms of Silicon Valley, had all sorts of exposures to different technology companies, Cisco, et cetera, that had IPO'd and made their employees tons of money. And it was a very real question, how could we attract and retain public employees in a very low unemployment environment in which the private sector was doing so extraordinarily well? Does that sound familiar, or was it just a wholesale give away the store?
Well, I lead more towards the wholesale giveaway. Trying to get people to work for the salaries that are offered, especially in public safety, never been a problem. I remember when San Diego was hiring firefighters and they had to open an arena because there were so many applicants. At one point, there were like 22,000 applicants for every firefighter job. That might be a suggestion that the compensation's out of whack. Currently, for firefighters in California, at the municipal level, it's a little lower at the state level, but at the municipal level, it's around $200,000 is the average compensation package for a California firefighter. Manhattan Beach, their average is top 300,000. There are a dozen cities where it's above 250,000. It's not hard to find people who will apply to those jobs, and it's ridiculous. So that's the excuse they used. And there's certainly some areas where there might have been some difficulty attracting people, but certainly not in fire. And there are plenty of people, for the higher paid, higher pensioned jobs. There's no problem getting people.
But that's easy for you to criticize because you were a reporter at the OC Register, so you were receiving $400,000 a year in total compensation as well, right?
Right, every day of the week.
Every day, yeah. Daily compensation. Yeah. But that actually brings up an important point that I've talked about with other guests. The role of newspapers like the OC Register in terms of having local beat reporters focused on this information. How has that changed?
Well, there just aren't as many reporters. The whole newspaper industry has, suffered. And we've seen the result, and without as much local coverage, you have fewer people. I think a lot of the papers, the Register and others, do a good job. They just don't have the number of employees and the number of people focusing on local content. And also, what you're seeing is a lot of the papers have become more regional, and they have to do more content sharing. It's economies of scale. It makes perfect sense, and it's just. We've seen what's happened in the journalism industry. It's changed a lot. A lot of the online journalism, there's good stuff everywhere, but there's also a lot that doesn't do in-depth reporting. So it's things like pensions. You really need reporters to be looking at the numbers and city budgets. And I don't think there's as much focus. There's a lot of opinion stuff out there. I just don't see as much focus on local budgets. And
well, there's also the underlying dynamic of when the news was distributed, and in 2008, 2009, there was still a quite significant debate about what the role of local news was, right? Warren Buffett famously invested heavily in community newspapers, which is now looking pretty much like a zero for the investment that he made. But this idea that channel controlled the information source for most people, facilitated the awareness of that information, right?
Well, there are all sorts of ways to get information, right? So there's some websites I go to, that have good pension information. And it's just sometimes you have to look at the numbers yourself. So there's one site I like called Transparent California, and it will boggle your mind when you start looking at the pay and benefit packages that California public employees receive. You just see page after page of police sergeants with total compensation packages in the $300,000 to $600,000 range. Just look at it for yourself. And that's why we have a pension problem in California, because we're paying public employees based on their political power and the deals they're able to get at the local level and in the state capitol. And okay, so you were talking about in 2009, there's talk that, we're in a new economy that's never going to go down again, right?
Or 99.
99, I'm sorry. By 2009, we saw that isn't true.
Right.
But in the ensuing years, when the economy has bounded back, what has the state legislature done? What have city councils done? They're back to the same thing. They're pretending that the stock market will continue to just perform and perform. It's a little bit ironic seeing California Democrats who, they have iron control of everything in the Capitol, wholly dependent on the Trump economy to keep their budget. So we just had a record-setting more than $220 billion budget, and the governor's putting a few more billion towards pensions, but throwing another $3 billion towards a pension hole that's estimated anywhere from $350 billion to $1.5 trillion, depending on whose calculations you want to use. And of course, defined benefit pensions are based on guesswork. So CalPERS and CalSTRS use a rate of return. They expect a rate of return of 7%. It's reduced somewhat from what it was before, but those are pretty high rates of return. I mean, I know most people, if you could guarantee a 7% rate of return, a lot of people would just put their money there. So it's a pretty aggressive rate of return still. If you go closer to the Treasury rate, then the unfunded liabilities are much higher than that. But here's the big question. So after, it's been another decade of really well-performing record stock market returns, right? And CalPERS and CalSTRS are only funded at around 70%, meaning they only have 70% of the funds needed to fulfill all the pension promises made to current retirees and current workers. What happens if the stock market does go down? And I was in the press pool for a long time, and Jerry Brown, I actually like in many ways. He would always, at his budget and May revise, he would always have those charts, and he'd have these charts and he'd point, and it showed down years outnumbering up years. And he would always warn of a recession. Recession's right around the corner. There's always a chance of recession. I think he's right. I mean, we don't have one. I don't want one, but at some point, it's more likely than not that we're going to have a recession. And then what happens to those unfunded pension liabilities? What happens to these cities that are begging the state for some kind of relief? And they're cities are pushing, and some of them 16% of their budget going to pensions. For police, 50%, typically 50% of the salary they get goes to pensions. In some cities, it's up to 100%.
Well, in Vallejo, California, you had a statistic, I believe that was 85% of the budget for public employee salaries or public employee compensation was going to pay pension costs before they filed for bankruptcy.
I don't recall. 85% sounds high.
Okay.
For just pensions. I would think that would be for total public safety
I think it was
budget.
85% of their total public employee spending. So roughly half of the total amount was going to the pensions.
Well, what I could say is I don't have statistics in front of me. Is that the percentage of budgets going to pensions and public employee compensation overall is skyrocketing. In San Jose, it went up 350% in a decade before the city put a ballot measure to reduce pensions, which was then overturned by the courts. So cities are in a jam. There's nothing they can really do, and they're watching the curve go like this. So what are they doing? They're cutting their workforce. A lot of cities, when they came to this CalPERS meeting in 2017,
just very quickly, CalPERS is the California Public Employee
Retirement System, right? So they were like Oroville. The city finance director in Oroville said, we're talking about the B word, the bankruptcy word. They're worried. They're watching. They said they reduced their workforce by a third, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing cutbacks. Former Assemblyman Joe Nation, Democrat from Marin County, who now is at Stanford Economic Institute. And he did a study a couple of years ago about crowd out, which is just a pension geek term for we're spending so much on pensions that we're crowding out park maintenance and everything else. So I have a house in Stockton. I'm in Stockton a lot. It's a nice old city, and the infrastructure is crumbling. They don't have the money. So much of the money is going to pensions. So even after bankruptcy, city officials chose not to abrogate the pensions, reduce the pensions, even though Judge Klein, said that they could. Instead, they raised taxes. So on the March ballot, 231 California cities have some sort of, and school districts have some sort of tax, bond, school bond, parcel tax, transient occupancy tax, some sort of tax measure. And they, so none of them are going to be pitched as a pension tax. They're a public safety tax or a school facilities tax, but money's fungible. If you use all your money for public employee compensation, you got to find money elsewhere, so they go to the taxpayer. So just like after Stockton had its workout plan approved by the bankruptcy judge, they went and asked for a public safety tax. And of course, local people in cities, they want to have safe streets, so they usually vote yes. But that money's needed because of the pressure coming from pensions.
So what can your average voter actually do? right? What can your voter do in the face of that? Because nobody wants to run the risk that those in charge of public safety say, well, you didn't fund the public safety tax, therefore you have none.
Well, it's the dilemma that we always get up at the legislature, right? They hold transportation funding hostage. In other words, they spend all the money on these ever-increasing general fund budgets. They spend it on various and sundry programs of all sorts, and then they don't adequately fund road infrastructure. They certainly don't adequately fund water infrastructure. And then they put a bond on the ballot saying, hey, if you don't vote to raise your, state bonds don't directly raise your property taxes, local bonds do, but if you don't vote for this additional borrowing, you're gonna have crummy roads and you're gonna have inadequate water infrastructure systems. And then voters tend to vote yes, and then they still have crummy roads and crummy water infrastructure systems, because then, especially if you look at some of the bonds, a lot of them go more to pork barrel projects than to things, but some of the spending helps. Yeah, it's a dilemma. I tend to vote no. I believe in trying to force the government to live within its budget. They're never going to do that. And I don't think they're going to fix the pension problem until there actually is a recession. And then everyone's going to be running around the Capitol going, oh my God, we didn't see this coming. It's the perfect storm. Yeah, there's so many perfect storms. No, it's a storm that you've seen coming for a decade.
Well, it'll be the most beautiful storm, the biggest, most beautiful, perfect storm. Yes, it'll be huge. The underlying dynamic that we're seeing is this dynamic of factions that are extraordinarily motivated, right? So the pensions are very important to the public employee unions. Mm-hmm. And an additional $100 tax assessed to my property in Marin County or wherever I happen to live, Stockton, it's not catastrophic to me at this stage, right? So while I may grumble and I may be upset about it, I'm not going to stand in the way, right? Or at least that's what we're seeing in terms of the voting behavior of homeowners in the state of California. If we take the money away, if we refuse to vote for these issues, what happens then?
Things are going to not get built. And look, I'm not a political activist. I just said what I do, but it neither way works, right? If you give them the money, you just get more of the same. If you don't give them the money, you get more of the same. So it's not as if I think at the local level, if voters reject a school bond, I remember one measure, this was back in Ohio, there is no plan B. You have to vote for this, or there is no plan B, the world's gonna end. And the voters rejected it, and the next day they came out with plan B. So I'm all for trying to force them to come to plan B, but I'm not a political activist. I have no illusions that voting one way or the other, voting for one candidate or voting for one measure or not, is gonna do anything. I think the outside economic pressure is what is ultimately gonna force people in the legislature or the local cities to do anything. But the cities are in the real pickle. The state budget, only a small portion actually goes to pensions. At the local budget, a large portion goes, and a huge portion goes to public employee compensation, and those numbers are going up. So, to the local voter, I say, I mean, you're going to be funding, you're going to continue to help the city kick the can down the road, but they're looking at closing parks and reducing every sort of budget. I mean, that whole crowd out phenomenon is real, and it's just a mess, and it comes from the political power of unions, and people tend to go along to get along, right? If you're running for office and you're going to try to do something about pensions, I could introduce you to a number of candidates who've tried, and most of them are no longer. They're no longer. They're ex-candidates.
Yeah. So when you think about the underlying dynamics of the players at this game, right? I was having a conversation with Michael Janest, who we both know, about some of this dynamic. And part of the challenge, as I see it, is that nobody in the process is intending to be, at least almost nobody in the process is intending to be a bad actor, right? The union representatives represent their members. The politicians represent their constituents, understanding that the performance in their job requires first and foremost that the teachers don't go on strike, that the police show up, that you avoid the disruption that's occurring. The police and the teachers are rightly looking at themselves and their community, and with the exception of those who are benefiting from extraordinary largesse, probably look at their surrounding community and say, I'm middle class, right? This is California. $300,000 is a lot of money almost everywhere in the world, but if you happen to live in Orange County, $300,000 is very nice, but you're certainly not driving around in a Lamborghini, or at least you're probably not.
Okay, a nice Mercedes, maybe.
A nice, yes, right, on lease. But nobody is explicitly trying to be a bad actor in this process.
I don't argue that people are bad people.
Yeah.
They're just, the system is designed in a way where those with a great deal of political power get their way. That's the way politics is. It's just an imbalance in the power dynamic.
Yep.
So you shouldn't be able to spend more than you can afford. Of course, we look at the federal government. What do we have? $1 trillion annual deficits now and a $23 trillion debt. So I don't know. Maybe locals are looking at the feds for their inspiration. It's not about ill intent. I don't argue anything in my book about ill intent. It's just about the system as it's working right now. And
so how would you change the system? If I give you the magic wand.
Oh, it's real simple. On pensions, it's real simple. There are a few, you could sit down with some actuaries, some of whom you've interviewed, and talk about what you do. And you could move to first thing I would do, simplest thing, California rule. That's the rule that you cannot reduce pensions going forward, even going forward, right? Unless you give the employees an equal or greater benefit. So when I worked at one company, and I actually had a very small defined benefit plan. And a defined benefit is the plan you're guaranteed a rate of return based on a formula. A defined contribution is the employer gives a specific contribution, and then however the stock market works, like 401k. So the California rule has made it impossible for local and state governments to reduce benefits going forward. So need to overturn the California rule. The legislature could do that. The courts, the California Supreme Court just punted on a case, a Marin County case, and basically avoided dealing with the key issue, even though the Brown administration had written a very compelling brief arguing that they ought to take a look at the California rule. It was dealing with something called airtime. I mean, it's just a specific benefit, but they dealt with the airtime issue where you buy extra credits and reject it, and they allowed the state to remove that benefit, but they didn't deal with the California rule. So the legislature could go and change the California rule if it wanted to, which would just mean, like when I worked at this private company, starting tomorrow, I receive a lesser pension benefit. I'm not having anything taken away from me. I'm made whole through the end of today, but starting tomorrow, you'll get a lesser benefit. So that in itself would get the cities off the hook. I think public employees ought to have the same type of pension that others have, which is mostly 401k. I think it's impossible to have a defined benefit plan that doesn't get manipulated in the political process because we're guessing about rates of return. And the formulas are just naturally, it's easy for politicians to keep increasing the formulas. So most of us have 401k. I mean, how are we, most people retiring? Various investments you make in stocks and real estate, Social Security, whatever, 401k or company, pension benefit you get, and you reduce, you cut back on some lifestyle things when you get older. That's what people do. I don't understand why public employees get these gilded pensions that are so far above what everybody else gets. And then the public employee unions, they say, well, the average is only, $35,000 or $38,000, something like that a year. Well, that's true, but the average goes back many years, so it goes back 30 years, and it includes people who have only worked a short amount of time, and it includes every category. You know how averages are. And anyway, it's still about 3 to 4 times what the average private sector. Now, interesting thing was back in, was it 2011, former State Treasurer Bill Lockyer was speaking to some Northern California pension gathering, and he was talking about what he called pension envy. And that's, and he was very close to the public employee unions. And pension envy was a lot of us at the time, a lot of people were getting pretty upset as the state had a budget crisis at the time, and that propelled the pension crisis onto the front page news. Was it like $30 billion budget deficit? Even though that wasn't directly related to pensions.
It was an aggregate budget.
Yeah, but the pensions became an issue. Yep. So some cities like San Diego had a initiative, San Jose had an initiative to roll back pension benefits one way or the other. Anyway, that's what happened in 2011. And Lockyer had talked to the group and talked about pension envy. And he pitched the idea of we need to give something to private sector workers. And the idea that evolved out of that and others, I don't think he was the one who originally came up with it, but there was an idea that evolved. Finally in law, it's called secure choice. And it's like the state's created a mini social security program, but it only gives a teeny tiny benefit to private sector workers. So my point is that the goal was a political goal, as I see it, was to reduce pension envy, stop the rest of us from being so upset about the massive pensions that public employees get. But if you go to Transparent California or the Controller website, you'll see the size of those pensions, and it just isn't right. And unless you get that compensation part of it under control. So anyway, we started talking about what would I do?
It, yeah.
Well, California rule, that would probably
That'd
fix
be your
it
first
right
place
there.
To start.
Yeah, 401k, switch to that. That's much more dramatic, but the California rule wouldn't mean eliminating defined benefits, but then the 401k. So we could come up with a handful of things to do, and it would work. But you can't do it. It's political. Yeah, you can't do it because it's the political problem.
So what is required to change the political problem? Can it be done on an individual voter basis? Can we all say no, as you've suggested you do? Can we all vote a new generation of leadership in? Like, what is required to affect that political change?
Well, a lot of people have been working on changing the politics of California, and to no avail from what I see. So I don't know. I don't think anything's, I really don't. I'm not trying to be a nattering nabob, but I don't think anything will change until there's a fiscal crisis that precipitates change. Until, that's what happened last time, right? The state shaved its budgets because it just didn't have any money. And I remember it was in Pennsylvania. It was some mayor, right, who cut pensions, I believe it was. This was
yeah, I believe it was.
Was it in Wilkes-Barre or somewhere?
It was Hazleton,
Pennsylvania. Yeah, it was somewhere in northeast Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And public employees sued, and I think I'm doing this from memory, so
yep.
I think they won. And then the mayor, I just remember the mayor saying, "Great, I still don't have any money."
Yeah.
So when you get to the point where it's like, great, I still don't have any money, something will have to be done.
Now that I just said
was it Scranton?
Scranton.
Okay.
It was Scranton. But yes, you're 100% right. Nothing was solved. We still didn't have any money. And it does feel like this is a situation that can't be resolved without suspending some element of the political process. That's what worries me most about it. I know that you have libertarian leanings. It sounds like this is going to have to boil down to an executive decision, whether that's a judge in a bankruptcy case or whether that's
like in Detroit, where they had I didn't follow it that closely. I followed Stockton closely, but not Detroit that closely. So they had a receiver, right?
They went into receivership, yeah.
Well, I don't think that speaks to libertarianism one way or the other. I mean, if an entity is insolvent, you have to come up with a way to, deal with it. I don't know. I'm not a big guy on political solutions. I just,
You're a reporter at heart.
Well, I write about it, and I just don't. I've dealt with so many people. Like, here's the pension reform movement. It's a dogged group, and in this series here, I know you're talking to some of them, and they're some of the smartest people I know, and they are working extremely hard at it and trying everything. And I see local pension activists, in San Jose, that's an overwhelmingly Democratic city, and voters there, by almost 70% of the vote, approved a very significant pension reform. And the Democratic mayor, Chuck Reed, he's a great guy. He led that. I remember once I interviewed him and I said, so was this something this easy? And he looked at me, he said, Steve, none of this has been easy. It was hard work. And they got a overwhelming Democratic majority on the council and in the city to approve pension reform. Then the union sued and the courts threw it out.
Yes.
In San Diego, the city there, they did something different. They wanted to avoid the California rule problem, right? So they came up with a way to reduce pensionable pay. The pay they can deal with, and that would reduce the pensions. And they did a few other reforms that were all, none of it ran afoul of the California. But anyway, the state agency, the PERB, the Public Employment Relations Board, they tossed it out. So you just can't win, and you can't win in the legislature. So what do you do?
Well, and even within that, I mean, as you know, we were talking to John Morlock earlier, he managed to get legislation passed through the two houses to require transparency, electronic transparency of the budgets, right? XBRL markup. And Gavin Newsom vetoes it. I mean, what can be the possible rationale for why you would veto something that actually provides transparency to a process?
I've seen a lot of transparency bills die over the years because the affected groups don't want transparency. When I had talked earlier about those city officials who came to the CalPERS meeting, they were dealing with a John Morlock proposal at the time. And John, he had proposed some sort of transparency initiative. That's what they were about, and CalPERS rejected it. So yeah, it's better if we don't know what's going on and we just trust them, and that's their attitude, it seems. So yeah, you can't get any. I mean, John, if you sat down with John, I mean, he could fix the whole pension problem in 10 minutes, and then spend the rest of his life and our lifetimes trying to get it through. So that's the problem. It's a political problem, and I don't know what the answer is to political problems.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, those who have watched my episodes in the past know that my biggest concern is that we have a stalled political system, and that we will ultimately force a non-democratic solution through, right? And pensions tend to be the flashpoint at which the crisis occurs, right? So most democracies that experience pension crises don't emerge as democracies. Somebody has stepped in an authoritarian way to solve the problem.
I haven't thought about, what that kind of end result would be, but I mean, I look at Washington and okay, we have Republicans now, and they're spending even more than the previous group of Democrats. So it's just, to me, it looks like two groups arguing over how you spend it. It seems to be. I mean, if space forces and military buildups, they cost a lot of money too, and all this social welfare programs and Medicare for all. I mean, I don't see anybody calling for fiscal responsibility, and up in the state capitol, there are all sorts of spending proposals, and so the folks up there seem to be content spending as much as they possibly can. You can't have a budget deficit in California, and taxing as much as they possibly can. So we see on the March ballot a Prop 13 has no relation to the 1978 historic Prop 13 that capped property taxes. But this one would, it's a bond, it's just a school bond, state school bond, but it would increase the debt limit at localities. So local school districts will be able to start passing more bonds. And then in November, we're going to have a split rolls, which would split away commercial properties from the Prop 13 tax protection. So that's a union-backed thing. That's would be a massive influx of money. And I don't see any end to their appetite for taxing, and then they just can't tax enough.
We talked a little bit about Plunder, your book on the public pension dynamic. You're currently working on a project talking about water infrastructure, which is something that's really important for California in particular. Is it a similar story? Is it one of incompetence fueled by greed, or is there something different that's going on there on the infrastructure side?
Well, what we have is our state A lot of it under former Governor Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's father, but preceding him even more. We built an amazing plumbing system, right? And the feds too. We've got the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project and the Colorado River Aqueduct, which Metropolitan Water District of Southern California built. And we've created this amazing system. And the state's population continues to grow exponentially, or had. It's only growing by like 0.5% or less now, but it had been growing exponentially, and we just haven't kept up with water systems. And the environmentalists have such sway over water policy, and their goal is just to flush as much water in-stream flows right out to the Pacific Ocean. So what we have is a political situation where the power balance has shifted, and we have enough water in the state. We're just not building enough facilities to capture it, and everything, even like a desalination plant in Huntington Beach, is being held up by the California Coastal Commission over concerns about plankton. I mean, there's an awful lot of plankton in the Pacific Ocean, and it just seems like any small project, even small storage projects like raising Shasta Dam, it comes up against lawsuits and environmental constraints, and we're all for a clean environment. It's just the environmental movement seems to be adamantly against water storage. I think a lot of it is growth control. I think it's a different dynamic. Part of it is state incompetence. I mean, the state governments don't do a good job maintaining their infrastructure. So we saw the Oroville Dam, when the spillway was in danger of crumbling, and they evacuated almost 200,000 people in that area. And I just saw a report on the condition of the state's dams, and they're in terrible shape. Well, a lot of them are in terrible shape. So
the stock market going up has fixed that as well, though, right?
Oh yeah, the stock market.
It's all fixed by the stock market.
It all fixed up. That and home values going up. So everything the state touches, whether it's the housing market but the water infrastructure is pretty important, and we do need things like better water pricing. But we need to do things like, and it can be done. We need to do things like raising Shasta Dam. The dam 600 feet. It was designed to be 800 feet, and an effort to raise it by 18 feet is going to go by the wayside.
This is. But I mean, to clarify, like what the concerns are on these types of things, right? There are animals that live on the shoreline, and if you raise the dam level, you're going to damage their habitat. There will be adverse consequences. But nature tends to adapt, right?
Well, I mean, there are concerns.
Some snails will die in the construction, in the raising of that dam.
This whole area used to be just inundated with floods, right? Yep. I mean, when I forget which governor had to take a canoe to the Capitol to be inaugurated after the Great Flood. We've
the Sacramento Delta area that you're.
Yeah, this whole area, and the Sacramento Delta. I mean, you need to restore fish habitats. Yep. There's no problem, no question about that. I mean, but the effort, to build tunnels underneath the delta to separate the water supply from the habitats, which would potentially accomplish both. The environmentalists were against that. Nobody's saying we don't need to have fish habitats to protect those, but just letting water flow out to the sea isn't necessarily doing that. There are many reasons for the decline of the Delta smelt. Part of it is Sacramento and Stockton dumping, the sewage they dump into the Delta, and Sacramento only recently started tertiary treatment. Invasive species, striped bass. Yeah. So when I covered in the middle of the drought, when the state and feds were going to largely empty New Melones Reservoir to save a dozen hatchery-raised fish, that all would have been instantly eaten by the striped bass before they got anywhere close to the Pacific Ocean. So anyway, water, we could do a whole segment on water. Maybe we will after my book comes out.
I would actually very much enjoy that. When you think about this type of dynamic, though, why things are getting bound up, is it classic NIMBYism? Is it make work for environmental engineers and impact statements? What is driving this resistance?
Well, I mean, there's a difference of philosophy, and of course, I have environmental concerns also, but I do believe that a lot of the environmental opposition is just entrenched opposition to more water for farms and people, right? And it's a lot of it's growth control. That there's this concern that if we it's just a change in philosophy. I think Governor Newsom Governor Brown had a fairly mixed policy. Some of his ideas were good, and some of them, were sided more with the environmental side. But he also proposed Schwarzenegger proposed it, but he advanced the twin tunnels idea and called for more storage. Newsom is moving more in direction, but he's done a variety of things too. I mean, he's suing the Trump administration over the biological opinions for endangered species regarding the Delta, but he also vetoed Senate Bill 1, which would have undermined the voluntary agreements with water districts.
What I hear in these discussions is this overwhelming sense of frustration that there is no solution.
Oh, I'm not frustrated. I'm just explaining it is frustrating.
Well, you are frustrated. I don't mean to explain
yeah.
it in the terms of bitterness or anything else, but there's just a genuine frustration that we really can't fix this problem under anything that looks like the current situation.
Well, things can be fixed. It's just it's hard to see a political system fix things unless there's a crisis, right? I mean, when does anything, even at the federal level, the state level, when do things get fixed outside of crisis? I mean, we're fixing Folsom Dam and expanding that, and that after the Oroville Dam is being all sorts of work there after the problems that we had a couple years ago, and after the drought. Some of these projects have been approved, but it seems to take a really dire situation before we get there, and we've become a very big and inefficient government. How do we fix the public school system in the state? It's certainly not just throwing more money at it, which is what this in the last decade, where test scores have not done very much, and yet we just keep throwing more money at it.
Well, it's unfortunate because there's feedback loops, right? And so if we choose to throw the money that we have available in the public school system towards paying the pensions of existing or retired teachers, then fewer resources are available to the students of today to become productive members of society tomorrow, which in turn makes it more difficult to finance, right? So all of this is creating a feedback loop. The challenge that I see more than anything else is that there's simultaneously the desire to not address it today because we're all waiting for that crisis. But if we wait for the crisis, we're inevitably going to have the most haphazard, most expensive, least well thought out outcome.
Most likely. I've worked on bills in the legislature. It's really hard to get things through, especially when you have a political philosophy more like ours, right? Or more of a free market philosophy. There's not a lot of appetite for that. So then that gets back to your, discussion about politics. What do we do? Well, elect more people who think like us. Well, if you look at a lot of the districts, and even after the redistricting commission, you look at the districts. I mean, the voters, you're going to have a hard time convincing voters of our ideas based on the registrations in the district. I don't know. You have to convince. I think we're at a point where you have to convince people of ideas.
Well, that's certainly part of the reason why we're having these discussions is to make people aware of them, to help people focus on them. Part of the thing that worries me most, and we talked about this a little bit early on, is the fact that simultaneously the delivery of a focus on local knowledge has deteriorated because of the loss of the local newspaper, the local beat reporter, relative to our focus on the national stories. So we're very focused on resistance to Trump or on something else as compared to resistance to the public union or the challenges associated with providing fire services in a fire-prone area like Northern California or Southern California. This has been a fascinating and unfortunately very sobering discussion as we move forward in terms of both the development of the economy and potentially move towards some type of crisis. I'd love to be able to sit down with you again to discuss it. And when your book on the water story comes out, I'd love to have the chance to review that with you as well.
That would be great.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.